Hi there. So, I want to talk about astrological education and the effect that that has on professionalism. And you have to bear with me and let me tell you a story, because the story is really going to illustrate a couple of points that most astrologers don't think of when they attempt to contextualize this debate. So, believe me, I will get to a point. Okay, so let's start with World War II of all places. But there are a couple of reasons to start with World War II, which is that after World War II was over with, there were some massive changes in a whole bunch of areas of education in the United States. Because World War II essentially brought up at the time what a number of people realized were deficiencies in the American educational system. And one of the things that World War II specifically brought up was the need for specific technical training. And basically, what came through that period and came through the experience of people in the Army and in the armed forces in general was that the officers, which were just, say, the administrators or managers, needed a lot of different kinds of training that they hadn't needed before. And so what happened out of this period of time is also a major growth in the social sciences, psychology and sociology particularly. And there, a lot of the impetus to the growth was really some very heart-wringing and hand-wringing questions about how did some of the atrocities of World War II take place when it wasn't demonstrable that all of the people involved in the atrocities were horrible human beings, but many of them were decent human beings who were, shall we say, manipulated into the process. Now, one very important psychological school that came out of this was Maslow's school, and of course also you have the birth of the modern schools of psychology. Also out of this impetus to look at how good people could do bad things. And also different ways of trying to understand how people do good things. Now, Maslow especially was very influential in the workplace. And I think it could be stated pretty definitively that his impact on vocational psychology was actually more massive than his impact on psychology in general. And also, this is where Jung comes into play, not in astrology, but in psychology, that he was actually far more influential through the development of some of the psychological testing, such as Myers-Briggs, than necessarily as a consulting psychologist, so to speak. Okay, well, in the process of this happening, there were impacts on the educational system. And what started to come into play with this massive influx of people into the universities as a result of the GI Bill was that you had the development of what we now call standardized testing. And it was really only in the wake of World War II that there was a change in the educational philosophy to start looking more closely at things like accreditation, for example. Accreditation existed before then, but it was just kind of an asterisk. Standardized testing really came to the fore, and in this there was considerable input from educational psychologists. Now, why am I bringing all this up? Well, I'm bringing this up because this also represents the time that what we call the professions became codified in their modern or current forms in the United States. And I'm reminded of a science fiction story, actually. One of the most popular of the original Star Trek episodes was City on the Edge of Forever. And City on the Edge of Forever has a plot line where Dr. McCoy inadvertently goes back in time to the 30s and saves a woman's life. And that woman turns into becoming a powerful pacifist who stops the United States from getting involved in World War II, with the results essentially that the Nazis win. And so, of course, in the episode, Kirk and Spock come in and save the day and eventually allow the woman to die. And there's a whole, plot out of that. But one of the follow-up novels actually took up the fact that this timeline, where McCoy saved the woman, actually had to take place in some way, shape, or form because Kirk and Spock had to know to go back to stop that from becoming the main timeline, so to speak. Now, the reason I bring this up is a very simple thing. This is McCoy getting stranded in the United States in the 1930s. He eventually finds a way to practice medicine. And this is my point. In the 1930s, something like this could happen because he could simply say, well, I got my degree overseas. There was no sophisticated system of medical testing and medical certification. And all this system developed over the next few decades. Now, so what we have is that by the 50s and by the 60s, all of the major professions in the United States, and by profession I basically mean vocations where the practitioners of which would be considered at least upper middle class. In other words, profession is generally used to represent those vocations that are kind of more at the top of the heap rather than at the bottom. You don't talk about the profession of plumbing, not because plumbers don't make a lot of money, because oftentimes they do, but because plumbing is not considered to be, so to speak, a high-class vocation in our high-class society. Actually, the roots of the vocation of plumbing are in the medieval guild system, where people learned by doing, not by going to school. And this is my point, that what started developing in the United States in the 50s and continued to accelerate was the idea that those professions, those vocations that come out of learning had to have a more sophisticated background in terms of their education and in terms of their testing and certification programs. Okay, so what you have happening is by the 60s and into the 70s and into the 80s and into the 90s, all of these upper class vocations developed very sophisticated systems of education and professional certification. Okay, now along comes astrology. In the late 60s and in the early 70s, the flower children generation comes along and gets interested in this thing. And the approach is very new age because people started seeing this as a spiritual trip, as a spiritual process, later as kind of an adjunct to psychology. All these things are happening. But this was happening outside of normal channels, so to speak. And so it came out of a place that was not part of this education professional system. And it came out of a desire of people, a very genuine desire, to understand themselves better. And, oh, wow, along the way, they discovered they could charge for readings. Now, somewhere in this process of charging for readings came the idea that if you charge for readings, you are a professional. Okay, well now, this is where our problem lies in terminology now, which is astrologers started using professional as a synonym for charging money. What had happened in the meantime is mainstream America had gone on, and professional meant schooling. And so what has happened is that in our current state, astrology has a dichotomy of believing that a profession doesn't have to go through the educational and professional certification the way that other professions do. And until everybody understands that we are going to have to go through these processes, what astrology is going to be is a vocation calling itself a profession. In other words, the terminology has shifted and astrology has not caught up with it.